When I look at Trump 2016 versus 2020, I see a colossal difference. I mean, I was one of the people sounding the alarm in 2016 that I think he can beat Hillary Clinton. I think he's going to hammer away on her weaknesses, hammer away on NAFTA and outsourcing jobs, and he's clearly using anti-corruption rhetoric, despite the fact he is taking money. He's framed himself as the anti-corruption candidate. There was this sense of like real finger on the pulse mixed in with some things that I would consider pretty dark and xenophobic, but there was an appeal there. I mean, I think of his closing ad in 2016, which was incredibly populist. And then now, I mean, this is how I described it to Crystal. 2016, he somewhat had his finger on the pulse. 2020, he became a Fox News grandpa. And then 2024, he's now like online brain poisoned in these far-right subcultures.
It went from like tabloid, which you have some familiarity with, especially New York tabloids. He went from like tabloid to Fox News grandpa to QAnon, to Truth Social.
Jack Posobiec, Mike Cernovich.
Yeah,
that's where we're at now.
Elon Musk's Twitter. So, that's where his brain is.
How do you describe the difference between 2016 and 2024 for his campaign?
Yeah, so at the level of like his messaging as a campaign, that shift is very real. The irony is that in the GOP primary in this cycle, Trump bumped Ron DeSantis, who ran within the GOP primary context. Ron DeSantis ran the platonic ideal of a candidacy in a campaign pitch to the kind of the weird online right.
Right.
And it didn't resonate. Right, like Trump, like sort of barreled past them for that, and of course, you know, the emblematic event of that was the decision to launch the campaign with Ron DeSantis. I'm talking about launched his campaign on a Twitter space in conversation with Elon Musk, where it wasn't even clear which one of them was going to run for president. You know, the power dynamic in the discussion was lopsided in Elon's favor, and then afterward, they put out this bizarre video that was hastily put together that had Ron DeSantis talking about the wages of the opioid and fentanyl crisis, while the footage showed Elon Musk in a tuxedo, like dancing with an electric guitar or something like that. I don't know if you guys remember this. But that was like my reaction at the time was like, this is too weird and too online. And Trump didn't do that. Like, he ran like a normie. But then, you know, to validate your point, Kyle, then comes the time for a general election campaign, and Trump's the nominee, and he does a Twitter space with Elon Musk, which, you know, fine to do it, but then in it, he basically has this kind of libertarian tech overlord worship that has become characteristic of the populist right, where he's like, Elon, you like to fire people en masse when they strike. You tell them there's no jobs for you, and tell you what, I love that. We got to fire. And so it was a very anti-labor message, which was immediately clipped together into this devastating ad by the United Auto Workers, where they just played those lines. Why was it emblematic of a disaster was because a few weeks earlier, they'd had what I considered a fairly successful Republican National Convention, at which the president of the Teamsters, Sean O'Brien, was speaking, the first representative of his union to address Republicans, and it was going for this kind of pro-worker conservatism thing. And Sean O'Brien looked foolish, I hate to say, or not. It wasn't Sean's fault. He was made to look. He was made to be put in this unenviable position. And of course, he rightly then O'Brien put out a statement saying what Donald Trump and Elon Musk were talking about there is economic terrorism. But again, it's that stuff, like really, really extreme tech libertarian overlord stuff, plays well to like this very ultimately fairly small online right subset, not to the wider country. And I thought that having defeated Ron DeSantis on those terms, they wouldn't succumb to the same temptation to pitch themselves to the online right.
Well, also, what do you make of the choice of J.D. Vance for the ticket and where he fits into these online right subcultures?
Well, I've been pretty supportive of JD. and I think he represents, alongside a few other lawmakers, mainly in this Republican lawmakers in the Senate, this attempt to like seriously shift the Republican Party away from its free market orthodoxies. If you think about his record as a senator, which by the way I don't hear about from the campaign itself, these are things I would have touted, but all the things that JD has achieved are, achieved or set out to achieve as a senator are done, first of all, in a bipartisan way, whether it's partnering with Senator Liz Warren to claw back executive compensation from banks that had to be bailed out by the taxpayer, or partnering with Senator Warnock on reducing insulin prices, to his own fellow Ohioan Senator Sherrod Brown, the Democrat senator from Ohio. They partnered up on a railroad reform bill. And in each of these cases, the opposition to these bills or reforms comes not from the Democrats, it comes from the kind of Chamber of Commerce faction of the Republican Party. So, so of course I welcome the choice of JD Vance, but what my hope has been is that JD will elevate populism into this kind of a serious agenda, this policy. And they are doing some of that, but too often it's been drowned out by, the kind of stuff like the Haitians eating cats and so forth,
which really originated with him, and which he doubled and tripled down on, and then gave that interview to Dana Bash where he said, well, if I have to create stories to get people to pay attention, that's what I'm going to do.
Now, to be fair, though, just in the spirit, when he said create stories, that was, I think, misinterpreted as I'm going to create false stories.
But he did create a false story for him.
But
I know his excuse is, I'm going to push this to get attention to something that's important. The other lie there is that the mainstream press hadn't covered what was going on in Springfield, Ohio. The New York Times and PBS had already done significant stories about Springfield, Ohio. It's just because it didn't contain these salacious and outrageous lies, they're received and they're taken, okay, there's some pluses and minuses and this town's struggling with it, okay. The nuanced story wasn't a, tabloid headline that they could use. So,
no, I appreciated that Times story.
Yeah.
It was something that was framed as like, immigrants had helped revive this Ohio town, and then a car accident happened or something like that. Which okay, that's a certain framing.
But I want to
in the body of the piece,
mm-hmm.
the grievances of the local community in terms of the pressure that this was putting on local services like schools and healthcare and so on was aired out in the New York Times, and that's something I've been saying on Twitter to. Again, the online right types were like, well, if they hadn't gone for the cats thing, no one would be talking about the wages of immigration in a place like Springfield, Ohio. I was like, no, actually, to be fair, the mainstream was talking about it.
So I want to push you a little bit, because there's something here. There's a tension here with regard to JD Vance that I think is interesting to tease out. Because on the one hand, I understand, given your ideological positioning, if you look at the United States Senate, JD Vance, you look at the voting record and the legislation he's pushed, and the small areas, I would say, where he's broken with Republican orthodoxy. Okay, I understand why you would look at that and say, this is, of all the Republicans you could pick, this would be one of my favorite candidates. So then what does it say then that when he gets out on the campaign trail, first of all, I mean, he's the one who leads the Haitian pets thing, and it's not like he has really leaned into the type of like, hey, let's do child tax. That hasn't been a central part of his pitch. It has been more to lean into this sort of like subversive, online, conspiratorial culture. And I wonder what you make of that, because I don't think JD, I mean, he's an Ivy League educated person. I know he's a very intelligent guy. I think he knows what he's doing, and doesn't feel like if he's just out there pushing for like paid family leave, then he just sounds like a lib. Or even, some of the interviews that have been unearthed where he's talking about childless cat ladies and we got to punish the childless and those sorts of things. It feels like he wasn't really chosen because of his new right economic ideology so much as the way that he plays effectively in the culture war and the way that he appeals to that Tucker Carlson crowd.
I think that's partly, again, there are things in the Trump platform which I think are still legitimately populist, and again, I think bringing immigration under control is a legitimate grievance and a legitimate populist issue. I also think the tariffs agenda, coupled with industrial policy, and that's an important part of it, which we are not seeing yet from Team Trump, but the universal tariff coupled with industrial policy is a valuable step. I think one of the problems, I wrote another piece for the New Statesman where it was, the headline was Donald Trump's identity crisis, that you're putting your finger on, is that in 2016, and Kyle said this too, but in 2016, it was easier to be populist because the bipartisan establishment was so committed to neoliberal globalization, just like open up, it doesn't matter what we manufacture, we can just have a services economy, we can, who cares if all manufacturing goes away, et cetera, et cetera. That was the elite consensus. And then Trump came along and he put his finger on the ravages of that model of globalization. And he did change the conversation so that by 2024, skepticism about the older model of globalization and insistence on reshoring industry and domestic manufacturing revival, et cetera, has become like the center-left establishment has granted that.
Yeah.
The Bidenism was basically, is in some ways Trumpism under a different name. And in some ways, Trumpism better, more effectively executed. If you think about like a legislative agenda, like the IRA and the CHIPS Act. Yeah. So that leaves so where do they go from here if the right populist? Now I would do X, Y, Z, but I would say that they've not reached a good answer to that. And the second factor, I think, is just the enormous influence of a coterie of mainly Silicon Valley type and Wall Street type billionaires. I do think that in 2016, Trump could just really rely on his own for the most part. And 8 years later, I think, he's facing an enormous legal bill, whatever the merits of those various cases, it differs. And he's decided he wants to move as part of a pack as opposed to like Trump against the world. And the pack that he's chosen are like guys like Jeff Yass, who is a minority shareholder in TikTok. So that when Congress brings up this measure, which is perfectly Trumpian, right? It's about insisting that this firm divest its Chinese ownership. It goes after China and Silicon Valley. You couldn't ask for a more Trumpian issue. Trump flip-flops and says, no, I'm opposed to this bill. Of course, it didn't escape anyone's notice that Jeff Yass is a minority shareholder in TikTok. So that's an ongoing dynamic of the Republican Party, which I wouldn't want to put all the blame on JD, because I just think like the party is much more beholden to its oligarchic wing in some ways than the Democrats are. And we can get to why, but I think it's because big capital has come to see the Democratic Party as the reliable party of state or the reliable party of government. And so they have to kiss the Democratic Party's ring and they have to compete for its favor. Whereas the Republican Party is this kind of rump party of the small and regional capital. And then they have a few oligarchs who support the party, and those are treated worshipfully, Elon, et cetera. And so, and I think that fact is inimical to a populist agenda. For example, even on immigration, a lot of these Silicon Valley kind of right-wing billionaires want more immigration. And you had Trump going and saying, if any foreign students graduates with just at least an associate's degree, a 2-year degree, we're going to staple a green card to their
diploma. Yeah, this was
sorry.
That was like a Hillary Clinton's position in 2016.
Well, but I think what you guys are proving here is that Trump the whole time is about Trump, right? So like this time, I feel like he's kind of tired after running twice and being president, and he went into, in front of a group of multimillionaires and billionaires at Mar-a-Lago, and he told them straight up, like the clearest quid pro quo of all time, like, you guys got to give me $30 million. You give me $30 million, I get you more tax cuts, right? So to your point about the flip-flopping on TikTok, I look at that and I think, what's the connecting tissue between this Trump and the Trump previously is the whole time it's all about, what do I think is good for me and getting in power? And that brings us to the J.D. Vance pick because apparently, according to the reporting, J.D. Vance was picked because Tucker and Trump's sons and Elon wanted him to pick J.D. Vance, and they thought this is like an heir apparent to ideological Trumpism. But I think for Trump himself, it came more down to J.D. was willing to be a sycophant and willing to say, hey, I wouldn't have done what Pence did with certifying the election. And so I think at the end of the day, honestly, I think the most accurate way to view Trump is I think the hardcore resistance liberals from the beginning were correct that it's like he doesn't really care about anything. He's about himself and getting himself more power and surrounding himself with yes men. I've grown to think that that's like the best way to evaluate his decisions because it seems like an ironclad law of nature every time he makes a decision that, oh, this is just about you. It's not some ideological project.
Yeah, I hate to pretend like other politicians don't have the same tendency or like that they're all just there just being idealistically committed. But I think it's not inaccurate to say that that this problem is especially so with Donald Trump. And, for a time, his ambition, and all politicians are ambitious, but for a time, his ambition aligned with a certain set of grievances that were not being addressed by the mainstream center left or center right. I mean, he barreled his way also past like 15, 16 conventional Republicans in 2016 by defying Republican orthodoxies, right? Calling the Iraq war a disaster, hinting at his support for a public option in healthcare, upholding entitlements, defending entitlements against Paul Ryan type quote unquote reformers and entitlement cutters. He's doing all this stuff and it feeds his ambition. It's just that 8 years later, the landscape is more complex, and feeding his ambition in part means like buddying it up with a very decidedly non-populist figure like Elon Musk, who's out to destroy the National Labor Relations Board. I mean, he's calling the National Labor Relations Board, the foundation of the New Deal, to be unconstitutional. Now, hilariously enough, I saw yesterday that the Autobahn Society has also joined this ridiculous theory.
I saw
the
that
Relations Board is.
I think Starbucks is involved also, aren't they? Yeah,
and Trader Joe's. So it's fun, and this is where we should be kind of hard-nosed about this. It's just an interesting observation that when it comes to their material interests, like the left wing and right wings of capital can perfectly set that aside and work. So like,
no doubt about it.
Otherwise, spurned by many of his fellow billionaires, when it comes to this battle, they're behind him.
Yeah, let's be comrades in arms.
All right, guys, this is just a little piece of a much longer conversation with Sohrab Ahmari talking about the difference between Trump 2016 and 2024 and what it's like to actually be a populist on the right and see that the right has gone insane and MAGA has gone insane. He has a lot of insight, a lot of interesting stuff to say. If you want to check it out, sign up below on Substack.